Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was a hot summer afternoon when Megan and her friends decided to cool off at the local community pool. It was one of those pools that had seen better days, the faded blue tiles, the rusted diving board, and the murky water that always seemed a little too cloudy no matter how much chlorine they added. But it was the only pool nearby, and after a long week of work and stress, Megan was desperate for some relaxation. She arrived around 2 p.m., the sun beating down relentlessly, and as usual, the pool was mostly empty. There was a single lifeguard lounging under his umbrella, his eyes half closed, and a few other people spread out on the deck, trying to catch some rays. Megan slipped into the water, feeling the cold relief as she submerged herself, the weight of the heat instantly lifting from her shoulders. For the first half hour, everything was normal. The usual chatter, the faint sound of water splashing, the occasional laughter echoing off the concrete. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the atmosphere started to shift. Megan noticed that the pool had grown eerily quiet. The few people who had been there earlier had left, and the lifeguard had disappeared. She brushed it off, figuring the staff had just clocked out early or were taking a break. She was alone now, and there was a strange kind of peace in that, just the gentle ripples of the water and the distant sounds of the city. She swam a few more laps, stretching out her limbs, and was about to climb out when she felt something. At first, it was just a subtle sensation, a pressure on the back of her leg, like someone brushing against her. Startled, Megan looked down, expecting to see another swimmer or maybe a stray object in the water. But there was nothing there. The pool was empty, the water still and undisturbed. She shrugged it off, thinking it was just her imagination. Maybe the fatigue from the heat was starting to get to her. But then the sensation came again. This time, it was stronger, more deliberate. It was like someone was grabbing her ankle, pulling just slightly, enough to make her feel off balance. Panic began to creep into her chest as she quickly pushed herself toward the shallow end, her heart pounding in her ears. She tried to calm down, telling herself it was nothing. But as she reached the edge, she caught something out of the corner of her eye, movement beneath the water. It was subtle, almost too fast to catch, but something shifted in the deep end. Her breath caught, her gaze fixed on the ripples that had started to form without any apparent cause. Megan froze, unable to look away. Then it happened again. A hand, pale, thin, and unmistakably human, reached up from the depths, fingers clawing at the surface like it was trying to climb out. Megan gasped, her heart racing as she scrambled to get out of the pool. Her feet slipped on the wet tiles as she reached for the ladder, her fingers fumbling in terror. As she pulled herself out of the water, she could see it more clearly now. Something was beneath the surface, something long and pale, tangled in the shadows. A figure, its limbs impossibly long and thin, floating just below the waterline, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes wide open but unblinking. And then, without warning, it moved. It was fast, a blur of movement that sent waves crashing to the sides of the pool, as though the figure was in a frenzy to get to her. Megan didn't stop to think. She ran to the nearest exit, her feet slapping against the concrete, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of splashing followed her, too loud to ignore. She risked a glance over her shoulder, but there was nothing there. No figure, no movement, just the pool, eerily calm once again. She didn't care. She bolted out of the gate and into the parking lot, looking back only once to see that the pool was just as empty as before. The strange, unexplainable feeling lingered, though like something had followed her, waiting just beneath the surface. Megan never went back to that pool. The thought of what was still hiding down there, waiting for the next person to slip under, was enough to keep her away for good. To this day, she doesn't know what happened that afternoon. But every time she sees an empty pool, she gets that cold feeling, like something is watching, waiting for someone to come too close, and she knows better than to test it again.
Story number 2.
There's a pool deep in the woods that the locals call the Widow's Pool. It's a strange place. No one talks about it much, and if you ask about it, people either look away or tell you to leave it alone. But in the summer of 1998, a group of college students didn't heed the warnings. Emily, Josh, Chris, and Sarah had been exploring the woods near their school when they stumbled across a narrow path that led to the pool. It wasn't marked on any maps, but there it was, hidden among the trees, a dark, stagnant body of water surrounded by overgrown shrubs and rotting wood. At first, it seemed like the perfect spot to relax and escape the stress of their final exams. The air was thick with humidity, and the sun was starting to dip below the trees, casting long shadows over the pool. The water was so dark that you couldn't see more than a few inches beneath the surface. There was a strange smell in the air, too, like mildew and something metallic. But they shrugged it off as the smell of an old, neglected pool. They decided to swim. Emily was the first to dip her toes in, and as soon as she did, she felt a sudden chill run through her body. She hesitated, but Josh urged her to jump in. She let out a nervous laugh and plunged into the water. The others followed, and soon they were all swimming, laughing, and splashing in the murky depths. But as the sun set completely, things started to feel off. The air became heavy, like the trees themselves were pressing in on them. Sarah noticed something in the water, something that wasn't quite right. There was movement beneath the surface, like a shadow darting just out of reach. At first, she thought it was just a fish or debris, but the movements grew more deliberate. Sarah screamed when she felt something brush against her leg, long and cold like fingers. She quickly swam to the edge, heart pounding. "Did anyone else feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The others shrugged it off, telling her it was just the water playing tricks on her. But as Sarah climbed out, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There were no ripples in the water. Nothing at all moved. The pool was unnervingly still. Josh, feeling a bit braver, dove under the water to show off. But when he resurfaced, his face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "There's something down there." "Something. I don't know what it is," he stammered, barely able to catch his breath. The others immediately pulled him out, and Josh scrambled to the edge, gasping for air. "I swear, it was like hands grabbing at my legs, and when I tried to swim up, I couldn't move." Emily laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the atmosphere had changed. The once carefree mood had turned to tension. The group quickly gathered their things, ready to leave, but as they turned to go, the water rippled once again. This time there was no wind, no movement in the trees, and then, from the depths, something emerged. It wasn't a person, at least not fully. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, stretching at odd angles like something unnatural. Its face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through them. Its skin was slick and wet, shimmering with an unnatural glow as it slowly pulled itself from the water. The air grew cold, and the smell of rot intensified, as though the pool itself was alive, feeding on whatever it could. Emily's heart thudded in her chest as she grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her away, but the thing in the water was getting closer. With a final, desperate scream, they bolted for the woods. They didn't look back until they were far from the pool, but when they did, they saw the water still moving, even though the creature had long since disappeared. It's said that once you find the widow's pool, you can never truly leave it behind. The creature, whatever it was, is always watching, waiting for the next group of curious souls to wander too close. They say the pool was once the site of a tragic drowning, a woman who lost her husband to the waters and never left, her spirit somehow twisted and corrupted by the depths. Others believe it's something much older, a dark force that lingers in the woods. But one thing's for sure, if you ever hear someone mention the widow's pool, take their advice and stay far, far away, because once it's found you, you'll never be able to forget.
Story number 3.
In the small town of Pine Ridge, there was an old hotel on the outskirts that had been abandoned for decades. The building stood like a ghost from another era, its windows boarded up and the paint peeling off its crumbling walls. No one ever went near it, and no one dared to speak of it, except in hushed tones among the older locals. But to a group of thrill-seeking college students looking for an adventure, the hotel seemed like the perfect place to explore. Rachel, Mark, Sam, and Jenna had heard the stories about the place. People claimed that the hotel had been the site of a terrible tragedy years ago, a fire that had claimed the lives of several guests. But even before the fire, There were rumors of strange occurrences, disappearances, and ghostly sightings. Some believed the hotel had always been cursed, even before it was abandoned. That night, they parked their car a good distance away, not wanting to draw attention. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows as they made their way toward the front entrance. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the old wooden doors creaked ominously as they pushed them open. Inside, the hotel was silent, save for the faint sound of rats scurrying behind the walls. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like tattered curtains. They explored the first floor, then the second, finding nothing but broken furniture and the remnants of a time long gone. But when they reached the third floor, things began to feel wrong. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, as though something was watching them from the shadows. Rachel, the most daring of the group, was the first to suggest they split up. "It'll be more fun this way. We'll cover more ground," she said with a mischievous grin. Mark, Sam, and Jenna hesitated but agreed, and the group split off into pairs. Rachel and Mark went down one hallway, while Sam and Jenna took the opposite direction. At first, everything seemed normal, but then Rachel and Mark came across something that made their blood run cold, a door at the end of the hallway that they hadn't noticed before. It was solid wood, with strange, faded symbols carved into its surface. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for them. Rachel pushed the door open, and the two stepped inside. The room was completely dark, but there was a faint, flickering light coming from a corner. As they moved toward it, they noticed something that made their hearts skip a beat. A bed, its sheets stained dark with what looked like old blood. A large mirror hung on the wall, cracked and broken, reflecting nothing but the darkness around them. Then, without warning, the temperature in the room dropped, and they both felt it, an overwhelming presence, a heavy, suffocating feeling that pressed down on them. Mark turned to Rachel, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could move, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. Meanwhile, Sam and Jenna were still searching the other end of the hallway, unaware of what had just happened. But when they heard the door slam, they rushed to find their friends. They pounded on the door, calling out to Rachel and Mark, but no answer came. Panic set in as they tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. That's when they heard it. A low, guttural sound coming from inside the room, like someone whispering in a language they couldn't understand. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, until it was a shrill screeching sound, like nails on a chalkboard. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Sam and Jenna rushed inside. But what they saw made their blood run cold. Rachel and Mark were standing in front of the mirror, their faces contorted in terror, their eyes wide and unblinking. They were no longer moving, and their skin had turned ashen, almost lifeless. Their mouths were open, but they made no sound. It was as if they were trapped in some kind of trance, unable to break free. Sam and Jenna tried to pull them away from the mirror, but it was as if an invisible force was holding them in place. And then they saw it. The reflection in the broken mirror wasn't just showing them. It was showing something else, something behind them, something dark and twisted, with glowing eyes and a twisted skeletal face. Before they could react, the temperature dropped even further, and the whispering grew deafening. The floor beneath their feet seemed to shift, and the walls began to close in, as though the hotel itself was alive, hungry for their souls. With a final desperate scream, Sam and Jenna turned and ran, pulling Rachel and Mark with them. They didn't stop until they were outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. But when they looked back at the hotel, they saw something that made their stomachs turn. The windows on the top floor were glowing, and for a brief moment they could see the figures of Rachel and Mark, still trapped in that room, their eyes wide open, staring out at them. And then, just as quickly, the light went out, and the hotel was dark once again. No one ever found out what happened to Rachel, Mark, Sam, and Jenna. The hotel was eventually demolished, but the stories persist. They say the hotel's curse still lingers in Pine Ridge, and if you're ever foolish enough to venture into the woods at night, you might hear the whispering voices, beckoning you to join the lost souls trapped within its walls.
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a weekend getaway for three friends to a remote cabin up in the mountains. Grace, Alex, and Jordan had rented it for a much-needed break from their busy lives, far away from their usual city stress. The cabin was cozy, surrounded by dense woods and an endless expanse of wilderness. It was the perfect escape. The drive there was smooth, and by the time they arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the landscape. They unpacked their things, lit the fireplace, and settled in for the evening. The first few hours were full of laughter, good conversation, and a few drinks to loosen up. But as the night wore on, an odd feeling started to settle in the pit of Grace's stomach. Something didn't feel quite right. The air outside had grown cold quickly, and the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was just the isolation of the place making her nervous. Around midnight, they decided to play a game of cards. The shadows in the cabin grew longer as the fire crackled, casting flickering shapes across the walls. The wind outside seemed to be picking up again, louder this time. But as they played, Grace couldn't ignore the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch outside caught their attention. They all froze, exchanging uneasy glances. No one else should be here. Not this far into the mountains. Grace's heart started to race. "Who could that be?" she whispered. Alex stood up, his brow furrowed. "I'll go check." He grabbed a flashlight from the counter and opened the door, stepping outside onto the porch. Grace and Jordan waited in tense silence, the sound of the wind almost drowning out the noise from outside. A few moments later, Alex returned, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. "There's no one out there," he said, his voice strained. "Just the trees and the wind." They tried to go back to their game, but the unease hung in the air, thick and heavy. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was as if the woods themselves were watching them, waiting. Her gaze kept drifting to the large windows, where the darkness outside seemed almost too deep, as though it were swallowing the light. Then the sound came again, this time from inside the cabin, a soft scratching noise, like something was dragging its fingers across the wood. The three of them exchanged nervous looks, their faces pale. "Did you hear that?" Jordan whispered. They all nodded, but no one moved. The scratching continued, now louder, more frantic, as if something or someone was desperately trying to claw its way inside. Grace's heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, her eyes darting around the cabin. "We need to leave," she said urgently, the panic rising in her voice. But before anyone could respond, the scratching stopped abruptly, and the air grew still. Dead still. The silence was deafening. Then, in a moment of terrifying clarity, the door to the cabin slammed shut on its own. The wind outside had died down, but now the air felt stifling, thick, almost suffocating. Grace felt like she couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the lights flickered and then went out entirely, leaving them in pitch-black darkness. A moment later, the fireplace crackled and flared, casting a brief glow on the walls. They heard a faint breathing sound, heavy, uneven, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. "Who's there?" Alex called out, his voice trembling. No answer. But then a figure emerged from the darkness, tall and impossibly thin, draped in ragged clothing. Its skin was pale, nearly white, with patches of dark, bruised-like spots. Its eyes were hollow, empty pits, as though they had been hollowed out long ago. The figure moved slowly, dragging one foot behind it, and a low, guttural growl echoed from its throat. Grace's blood ran cold. "What the hell is that?" she gasped. Jordan stood frozen in fear, unable to speak. Alex reached for the flashlight, but before he could turn it on, the figure moved closer, its hand stretched out toward them. There was something deeply wrong about it, something unnatural. It was as if it had no intention of hurting them, but simply of watching, of waiting. Without warning, the figure lunged at them with terrifying speed, its hands reaching for their throats. Grace screamed, but before the thing could make contact, the power in the cabin suddenly flickered back on. The figure froze for a split second, as if confused, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, dissipating into thin air. They stood there, gasping for breath, wide-eyed and trembling. But as the minutes passed, their senses began to return to them. They checked the cabin, every room, every corner, but the figure was gone. Everything was still, too still. The three of them packed up in a hurry, leaving the cabin behind as quickly as they could, not bothering to look back at the place that had nearly cost them their lives. When they returned to town, they asked the locals about the cabin and the strange figure they had encountered. An old man, his face wrinkled with age, looked at them with a knowing expression. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said in a hushed voice. "The thing that lives in those woods. It's been there for years. It doesn't need to hurt you to kill you. It just watches until you can't take it anymore." They never went back. And as time passed, Grace, Alex, and Jordan began to wonder if the creature they had seen was real, or if it had simply been a hallucination. But the fear they felt that night, the terror of being watched by something that could not be explained, stayed with them. They knew they would never find out what it truly was, and neither would anyone else. The cabin had been abandoned long before they arrived, and after that night, it was said that it was no longer safe to even venture close to the area. Something was still there, waiting, and once you noticed it, you could never forget it.
Story number 5.
In the small coastal town of Marshview, there was a lighthouse that had been standing for over 100 years, weathered and worn by the relentless sea winds. The townspeople often whispered about it, particularly when the fog rolled in thick and heavy off the water, swallowing the landscape in a suffocating haze. The lighthouse hadn't been in use for decades, long after the last keeper, an elderly man named John Whitlock, had disappeared without a trace. Some said he'd gone mad, obsessed with the ocean, spending nights gazing out at the waves as if something out there were calling to him. Others claimed he'd heard voices in the wind, beckoning him into the sea. Whatever the reason, when he was last seen, he was standing on the rocky cliffs below the lighthouse, staring out at the horizon, never to return. It was a few months later when a group of college students, Carly, Dean, and Jake, decided to visit Marshview for a weekend trip. They had heard the stories about the lighthouse, the eerie tales of disappearances, but they didn't believe them. They were all about urban exploration and thrill-seeking. So, one evening, when the fog began to roll in, they decided to make their way to the lighthouse to see what they could find. The wind was biting cold, and the fog had swallowed the entire town, leaving the streets eerily quiet. As they walked toward the lighthouse, the air grew thicker, the mist curling around them like fingers. The large, crumbling structure loomed ahead, its once proud beacon now dark and lifeless. Carly shivered but pushed forward, her flashlight cutting through the mist. They made their way inside, the rusted metal door creaking as they pushed it open. The interior of the lighthouse was damp and musty, the walls covered in mold and peeling paint. The spiral staircase creaked under their feet as they ascended, the sound echoing through the hollow building. It was like the lighthouse was alive, groaning and shifting as if it had its own breath. At the top, the large lens of the lighthouse was shattered, the once powerful light long extinguished. But as they explored the room, they noticed something strange. There was a journal on the floor, its pages yellowed with age. Carly picked it up and began flipping through it. The entries were dated back to the early 1900s, written in the scrawled handwriting of John Whitlock. She began reading aloud, her voice trembling with unease. The voices. "They call to me from the sea. I hear them every night now, faint whispers at first, but they are growing louder. They promise me things, tell me secrets of the deep. I cannot resist." The further she read, the more disturbed she became. The last entry was incomplete, just a single line scrawled at the bottom of the page. "I must go. They are waiting." Carly's voice faltered as she finished reading. The air seemed to grow colder, the silence oppressive. Dean, who had been inspecting the room, suddenly turned to face her, his eyes wide with fear. "Guys, I think we're not alone." They all stopped, listening. At first there was nothing. Then came the faintest sound, something scratching at the walls, a slow, rhythmic tapping. Jake turned to look, but saw nothing. His heart began to race. "Dean, stop messing around," Carly said, trying to brush it off, though she could feel the tension building in the air. But then the tapping grew louder, almost frantic. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The entire lighthouse seemed to be alive, vibrating with a deep, unsettling hum. Carly's flashlight flickered, and when it came back on, something was standing in the far corner of the room. A figure, tall, gaunt, And draped in tattered clothes, its back arched unnaturally. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but they could see its hands, pale, elongated, with nails like claws. Dean froze. "What the hell is that?" Before anyone could respond, the figure took a step forward, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. A voice, low and raspy, echoed through the room, sending chills down their spines. "Come closer." The air around them grew colder, their breath visible in the frigid air. Carly's flashlight flickered again, and this time, when it came back on, the figure was much closer, standing just a few feet away. Its eyes, dark, hollow pits, locked onto Carly's, and for a split second she felt like she was being pulled into them, trapped in the depths of the ocean. "Leave, before it's too late." The words were barely a whisper, but they carried an undeniable weight. Carly stumbled back, bumping into Dean, who was just as terrified. They all turned and ran, the sound of their footsteps pounding on the stairs echoing as they made their way down. But the lighthouse seemed to stretch endlessly, the stairway going on forever, the walls closing in. They couldn't escape. Suddenly, the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs filled the air, louder and louder, until it drowned out everything else. Carly's heart pounded in her chest as she looked back. There, at the top of the stairs, stood the figure. It wasn't just standing anymore. It was moving, crawling toward them, its arms stretching and bending at impossible angles. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. They made it outside just in time, but the fog had thickened. They couldn't see a thing, the world reduced to nothing but white, swirling mist. The sound of the waves crashed in their ears, so close now, like something was rising from the depths of the sea. When they finally stumbled back to town, breathless and shaking, they asked the locals what they knew about the lighthouse. An elderly woman, her eyes clouded with age, told them what they had not wanted to hear. "That lighthouse was never meant to guide ships," she said softly. "It was built to keep something in, and when the last keeper disappeared, it escaped." That night, Carly, Dean, and Jake left Marshview, vowing never to return. They never spoke of the lighthouse again, but every time they looked out over the ocean, they could hear it, the faint whispers carried by the wind, calling them back to the sea. And they knew they could never truly escape.